Okay, hi everybody. So this PowerPoint is really about how we have historically encountered death in the United States and then are currently encountering death and how that's changed over time. So get ready for lots of charts and graphs. And then we're also going to talk about how that relates to our current attitudes about death. Okay, so starting with death-related encounters, and I'll just give you a heads up that I find it very interesting that COVID really changed the narrative that we have had around how we encounter death in the United States. And so I'll explain that more. If you have time, I encourage you to watch this 3-minute video clip on the history of death. It's not just US focused. I think it's based out of the UK, but it gives a really nice overview. Okay, lots to say on this slide. So overall, as you're going to see when we start moving through the statistics, we've got decreases in our death rates or mortality rates and increases in our life expectancy rates. And so why is this, over the last several hundred years in the United States? A big one is industrialization, right? That's been happening since the end of the started at the end of the 1700s. This is things like when we started building factories and railways and roads. And all of this led to kind of the sharing and communication lines, right? Whether that was telegraph or, phone and then eventually the internet. And this allows for kind of the sharing of resources and knowledge, which raises the standard of living for everyone. Obviously, we have a lot of disparities, but now if, for example, one community experiences a crop failure, they can get food from another community. The second one would be public health measures, as we became more aware of germs and the importance of sanitation and clean drinking water. That changed a lot around why, the frequency of our deaths and the causes of our deaths, less around, for example, communicable diseases, things that you can catch from a person, from the air, from the water. We also have better preventative health care. We have vaccines, we have better prenatal care, we have condoms, we have education about not sharing needles, right? We also have a lot of advances in medicine. So, up until kind of the 1950s or 60s, we really couldn't cure that much. We were just kind of providing comfort care to people at the end of life. But now we have much more kind of cure-oriented medicine, and we're less likely to die from things that would have killed people in the past. So a few years ago, for example, I had an infected mosquito bite. It was MRSA resistant, and it was spreading down my leg, and it was the kind of thing that if left untreated in the past, I could have had damage to my knee joint. I could have died, but they were able to, intervene quickly with both topical and oral antibiotics, and it was not a big deal. A more serious example, for example, in times of war now, soldiers are less likely to die. They're more likely to come home with severe injuries, which is good, but also brings about, its own set of challenges. In terms of geographic mobility, families, it varies, right? But families tend to be more spread out now. People are more likely to move for education or for jobs. And so what that means is we have less day-to-day contact with our dying or deceased loved ones like we did in the past, where maybe a whole family was in the same community, in the same town, maybe even in the same house. And if someone was dying or had died, everyone kind of witnessed that. So that makes death seem a little less real, right? And something that we could perhaps escape. And then we have so much more of our deaths now, our lives are influenced by our lifestyles, like diet, health, exercise, substance use. And now at least half of all deaths are in principle preventable. Of course, we can't stop death forever. And so that's different than in the past when we were dying of, for example, a plague or a flu. Now, COVID threw a wrench in that story, right? Because suddenly it wasn't about your lifestyle so much as, it was this communicable disease that anybody could get. It wasn't a matter of how healthily you had been living, although that was a factor for some people, of course. All right, we're about to march through quite a bit of graphs and charts. And I think as you do this, just to help you keep your head above water, you might be thinking like, what do you want to find? What do you want to teach somebody else? What do you find most interesting that you want to remember and you want to pass along? I find if I'm in that kind of mental mode, then I'm more likely to be able to retain what I'm hearing. Okay, I love this chart, but unfortunately it hasn't been updated since 2017. So we'll talk about kind of what the data says from 1900 up until 2017, and then I've got some upcoming charts to kind of help us get a sense of what's been happening since then. So again, this just shows kind of what death rates look like in the big picture since 1900, and you can see that overall they've been declining, except for or up until 2017, except for during 1918 and 1919 with the Spanish flu. And similarly, life expectancy rates were doing the opposite, right? They were going up, except also again during that time of the Spanish flu. Okay, so this graph helps us understand a couple of things. It helps us understand what's happened since 2017, and we can see the spike in death rates due to COVID, which kind of interrupted our overall decline in death or mortality rates. And then we can also see differences based on sex. We know that across all ethnicities and races, which we'll get to, males have higher rates of death than females. And this is due to both biological factors and lifestyle factors. So for example, in terms of biological factors, males have XY chromosomes, and that means that they're more prone to what's called X-linked inheritance. If they have, kind of a faulty gene on their own one X chromosome, since the Y chromosome is so much smaller and missing so many genes, they may not have anything to cancel it out on that Y chromosome, whereas genetic females have two X chromosomes, and so if you get the short end of the stick on one X, you might have something to kind of counteract it on your other X. We also know, for example, that testosterone, which males are higher in, tends to promote kind of higher activity, aggression, and risk-taking behaviors, which can put more males more at risk. And then there are lifestyle factors, in addition, like just maybe generally risk-taking, substance use, higher rates of substance use, higher rates of deaths due to gun violence in the United States, suicidality. And so it's interesting, maybe you already knew this, that we are, in terms of the birth rate, we birth more like, 104 males for every 100 females. And this is to basically offset the higher rates of mortality for male babies, either at miscarriage, stillbirth, or even after death, and to try to make it more even by the time males and females reach kind of their reproductive years. And not surprisingly, this shows us the same thing, that after 2017, we continued to see a rise in life expectancy, but we took a dip during COVID with the increased death rate. So once we look at general trends, then we can kind of break it down based on different demographic groups, whether that's education or sex or race or ethnicity. And we can see that it varies a lot, actually, based on those demographic traits. So here we're looking at educational level, so whether or not you have a bachelor's degree. And we can see that life expectancy has been rising since 1995 for college graduates and non-college graduates, but then there's an increasing gap, right, based on your educational level. And now, currently, as of maybe 2020, we were seeing maybe a 6 to 7 year difference with those with a bachelor's degree living longer. Okay, so this graph shows us the significant disparities based on race and ethnicity, and it just shows 2 different years, and so you can note that death rates were decreasing between 2023 and 2024. But if you look at kind of who has the highest rates of death, Native American or indigenous populations, which are referred to on this graph as AIAN, American Indian and Alaskan Native, have the highest. Black individuals have the second highest, non-Hispanic white the third, and those of Hispanic origin the fourth, and Asian Americans the lowest. And so there's some questions that we can ask ourselves here. we can ask ourselves, why are rates so high for Black and Native peoples? And we can look to things like, of course, access to resources and healthcare, but we can also look to the long-term effects of racism and discrimination, displacement, and we can imagine that there might be epigenetic tags that are being passed along that way as well across generations. And so that can be factors, and then it can just be the ongoing effect of being a member of a minoritized population in our society. I almost never experience that, but when I do, for example, when I was in Morocco recently as a white female, maybe running in shorts and a tank top, I felt kind of that heavy male gaze, and it was stressful and disconcerting in my body, and I had to kind of do a fair amount of kind of self-talk just to keep myself calm. And it made me really reflect on what it would be like to be different in some way, whether that's a limb difference or my skin color, and we're talking about skin color here, or my gender identity or my sexual orientation, and just how that means that people are always just looking at you maybe a beat too long, right? And then the stress that creates, right? And the self-talk that generates. And so there's research on kind of the allostatic load that, for example, Black females carry, or that Black Americans carry in terms of the cognitive load, the amount of time that they're kind of spending screening for microaggressions and maybe having to respond to those. So we can imagine the toll that takes on your body, and then the less resources that you have to maintain your health. We also want to be asking ourselves here, why are those of Hispanic origin so low? Because they also experience discrimination in our society, and they're quite a bit lower than white Americans, less privileges overall. And so why is that? Is that because they have a different kind of historical experience with the United States, different epigenetic tags that have been passed along? Are there different kind of protective factors? So interesting kind of things to ask there. And then we also just want to note here again the powerful differences according to sex. So you can notice that for all ethnic or racial groups, males have higher rates of death than females. And so what that means is, for example, if you look more carefully here, white males are actually higher than Black females. So even though we say overall Black individuals are higher rates of death than white individuals, it actually depends on sex. Okay, so you might test yourself on this, on average, which of these groups has the highest mortality or death rate. Most of the time students on quizzes or exams guess Black female, but the order is actually as listed here. White males are the highest of this group, of these 5 groups, followed by Black females, who are higher than Hispanic males, who are higher than white females, who are higher than Asian males. So this gives us a sense of the interaction between race and ethnicity and also sex. Okay, another graph that I love that wasn't continued past 2017 by the CDC, unfortunately. So this shows us up till 2017, and then we'll have to do some follow-up slides to understand what's been happening since then. Okay, so this shows changes during that time period for 5 leading causes of death: accidents, cancer, heart disease, influenza and pneumonia, and stroke. And so if we just walk through these, accidents overall you can see are lower and declined until about 2000 and then have increased. And this is largely due to accidental drug overdose. So accidental death typically now includes things like drug overdose, motor vehicles, and falls. Also SIDS, suffocation due to choking, drowning. Less likely than in the past, we would see accidents including, for example, more likely in the United States, fires, mechanical accidents, farming equipment, things like that, more drowning. We can see that cancer rose from 1900 to 1990 and then has declined. Heart disease rose from 1900 to 1950 and then declined, and that's largely attributed to anti-smoking campaigns. Influenza and pneumonia, the only communicable disease up here, the only thing that you can catch, overall declined, but until 2017, because this was pre-COVID, but then spiked in 1918 and 1919 again due to the Spanish flu, which killed millions of people worldwide, including over 500,000 Americans. And then stroke, you can see, has declined overall. Okay, so this gives us a sense of the rankings and kind of magnitude of our current top 10 leading causes of death. Again, you can see that heart disease was number 1, cancer was close behind, unintentional injury, again, overdose, traffic accidents, and falls was number 3, COVID was number 4 in 2022. In 2020 and 2021, COVID was number 3, so it was higher. Then followed by stroke, chronic lower respiratory diseases, Alzheimer's, diabetes, kidney disease, and liver failure, which can trade back and forth. So far, we've been looking at death rates for all ages, but when we break it down, we can to more specific age groups, we can see some reversing trends. So when we look, for example, at death rates between the ages of 25 and 44, young adults, we see the reverse trend. We see that instead of death rates declining, death rates are increasing for young adults. And you can see that we saw a big spike due to COVID in 2020 and 2021, and now we are declining, but we're just barely down to, we're not yet down to pre-pandemic levels. The big things that have been contributing in addition to COVID have been drug poisoning, drug overdose, you can see. Then other leading causes are car accidents, other natural causes, which the best I can tell are things like liver and heart disease, also suicide, alcohol-related deaths, and homicide. So we could certainly make the case that there is kind of a crisis among mortality rates for young adults. Just drilling down a little bit more into drug overdose deaths, this graph shows the trends between 2015 and 2025, which shows kind of a big increasing from 2015, but then definitely around the time of COVID, we saw a big spike that we're still kind of coming down from. And so this is for a number of reasons. We saw a 30% increase in 2020. It's partly driven by the increase in fentanyl, which is, as I understand it, 50 times stronger than heroin and also tends to clump when you mix it. So you might get a variable dose and a dose that's too high. And then with during the COVID years, the increased isolation meant that more people were using alone, perhaps more people just using, but using alone, which put them more at risk if they did overdose, that no one was there to kind of call for help. And then if we look more specifically at gun-related deaths, suicide, and homicide, that story has changed too. I've been teaching this class a long time, so there was a period of time where I was talking about death rates due to guns declining, and now I've been talking about them going back up. And so you can see that we are still rising. This only goes up to 2020, although we remain below our historical peaks of the mid-1970s. Okay, we've now just got a few slides on infant mortality. And so this one is pretty straightforward, showing infant mortality in the US between 1960 and 1924. And you can see some pretty significant declines between 1960 and, say, 1990, and then kind of slower declines since then. Okay, so just like with death rates for the general population, we see some big disparities by race and ethnicity for infant mortality. We've got a few slides here on infant mortality. So these are infant mortality rates from the year 2022, and you can see, again, the highest for non-Hispanic Black, followed by Native populations, followed by Native Hawaiian, and then Hispanic, White, and Asian. And we spent some time in HDFS 101 talking about some of these findings. And for example, this is largely, we think, due to the health challenges for discriminated populations in the United States. And so, for example, Black mothers, no matter their age, marital status, income status, or educational status, are about twice as likely to have a baby die as compared to white mothers of a comparable income, education, marital status, or age. It's pretty staggering. So in terms of infant mortality around the world and where the US fits, obviously we're doing a lot better than developing nations, but compared to most other developed countries, we usually come in down near the bottom. And you can see the ratings there. And we'll talk more about kind of why do we think this is. You can see that there's also a big range among the states in the United States. So Vermont is the lowest as of this data in 2021, and Mississippi was the highest. Okay, so like we've been alluding to, compared to other developed countries, also related to life expectancy, the United States doesn't do as well. And we attribute this to, again, higher rates of infant mortality and low birth weight, higher amounts of accidents, that's car accidents, drug overdose, and then also homicides, higher rates compared to developed countries of adolescent pregnancy and STIs, HIV and AIDS. We mentioned overdose deaths already, obesity and diabetes, heart disease, and chronic lung disease. So overall, we have shorter lives and poor health than many other developed countries. Okay, so why is it that we are seeing a lower life expectancy in the U.S.? So generally, we think about kind of poorer health systems compared to many other countries. We don't spend as much money on universal health care. And so that's really, and then we've got a lot of people who don't have access to good quality health care. This really was driven home for me when I was visiting Copenhagen, Denmark, and they were talking about how if they go to the emergency room, it might cost them like the equivalent of $25 US. And they were really shocked and saddened, to know that in the U.S., medical crises, health crises almost always become financial crises for so many people. In terms of our health behaviors, on the one hand, we use less nicotine and sometimes less alcohol than some countries, some other developed countries, but we intake quite a few more calories. We have higher rates of many forms of drug abuse, and we are more likely to use guns, which can lead to suicide and homicide. We do have higher levels of poverty. We are a big country. We have wide gaps, higher rates of income inequality. We have less social safety net programs that buffer the effects of poverty and other disadvantages. It's not something that we have prioritized as much compared to many other countries. And then we have designed communities around cars, right? We aren't taking as much public transportation. We don't have trains that can get us all over the place, or metros, in many of our cities. And so this not only can discourage physical activity and contribute to obesity, but it also increases our risk for car accidents and impending death. Okay, so this idea of dying trajectories, shifting gears a little bit, has been around for a long time. And so it's this idea that you can categorize death based on how long it takes for the dying process to happen, and what's the kind of pattern or shape of the dying trajectory. These are the four standard ones. So sudden death, which we could say would be like car accident, drug overdose, but also, for example, something like the Spanish flu or COVID-19 might follow something close to this, or it might look a little bit like terminal illness, where you're kind of holding steady for a long time and then you drop off fast. Some terminal illnesses, people are pretty high functioning until the end. So for example, my mother-in-law died of pancreatic cancer in about 3 weeks, or 3 months, I should say. And so she was pretty strong until right near the end. If you've got a terminal illness that is more kind of up and down, then you might look more like the trajectory for organ failure. And then frailty, or sometimes called the dwindles, would be what we think of when we think of kind of dementia. And we used to experience death a lot more like the top two graphs. It was just kind of intense life or death crises. People either died or pulled through in a matter of days. And now we have more deaths that look like the bottom two graphs, with organ failure and frailty. The other changes in our patterns is that we used to have, we've kind of redistributed deaths more to the old rather than the young. And young people are at much less risk of dying for infectious or communicable diseases like influenza or tuberculosis. So we are much more likely to die of degenerative diseases than we are of communicable diseases. But COVID really threw a wrench in that story, and suddenly we were dying of a communicable disease again. Okay, so you can test yourself on this, and it is, adults are currently more likely to die of degenerative diseases in the US because the top leading causes are cancer and heart disease, more so than, say, COVID. Okay, so I find the changing data on the location of death really interesting. So this is just showing us from 2003 to 2017, and this is the most recent data I can get even now. So I know it's outdated, but I haven't been able to find anybody doing a more recent analysis. So as you could imagine, if we think back to like the early 1900s, people were more likely to die at home maybe than they were in a hospital. And then sometime, between over the 20th century, that switched and people were more likely to die in a hospital than they were at home. And so we can see that reflected in the graph at 2003. Then we are seeing just a big change, right? Where now people are more likely to die at home than the hospital. I, again, haven't been able to see data on how COVID changed that because I think more people died in the hospital with COVID than at home. But so we may have seen a shift in the COVID years, but then I think the trajectory is still kind of moving in this direction, the best that I can tell. And then you can see kind of home and hospital are the top places, followed by like a nursing facility, other assisted living, and then lower would be hospice facilities, just because there's not as many of those. Okay, so before you go on, you might just pause and think, like, what stands out for you? What, if you were going to get up and tell somebody something you learned right now, what would you tell them? How are things changing? And then how did COVID change our narrative around our encounters with death? Okay, so now we're moving from talking about death-related encounters to just a handful of slides on death-related attitudes. So as you might imagine, kind of our attitudes influence our encounters with death and vice versa, and I'll say more about that. And all of this is socially constructed. We talked about the social construction of death kind of in one of our first lecture, right? And so all of this is kind of constructed at the individual level, at the societal level, at the cultural level, and it can change over time. In general, we've been talking about how we are having kind of less direct personal encounters with death because we are dying at lower rates. We are less likely to have young people dying than in the past, although we are seeing a switch in that trend a little bit. Less kids, we don't live as close to our loved ones, so we might not be kind of witnessing their dying process. So in general, death is less in our face than it has been in the past. And I think that contributes to our kind of increased discomfort with death, more fear of death, and kind of this, maybe belief that death should be or could be avoided, that it's somehow unusual. And now you could imagine that individually, healthcare workers have a very different perception. They may have compared to the general population, much more encounters with death and see death as kind of likely and common. So we can see death attitudes being reflected in our current culture. And I don't know what you've noticed. We're going to talk about language on the next slide. But for example, movies, videos, just books, like my family, likes to watch all the Marvel movies. I like to read a lot of YA fantasy fiction. And both of those genres are filled with superheroes, people with superpowers, people with immortality, which gives me kind of insight into how we are, wishing that we could really conquer death. And then even when you think about kind of art, and if you've traveled around, I noticed that, in older art from, several hundred years ago, there's so much more emphasis on like hell and torture and demons and Satan and devils, and we don't necessarily depict so much of that, that focus on like the afterlife, heaven and hell so much in our art now, but that was a very predominant theme, or the Grim Reaper, or skeletons or skulls. That use of that can really vary over time. Okay, so when we think about death and language, we know that we have a lot of euphemisms for death. Many people are uncomfortable with the D word, died, dead, dying, death. And so they use kind of kinder, gentler words. And you can see a lot of these reflected on this graph, which was kind of what were the most common words used in obituaries by state in 2015. And so you can see some states like Texas used entered eternal rest, or Oklahoma was left this world, or other states were succumbed or lost his or her battle, went home, departed. Some states did commonly use died, but a lot of other kind of euphemisms for death. People also might say someone's terminal rather than dying. And so we're going to talk about kind of the challenges around this. Grief counselors often will suggest kind of using the D word because it's more concrete. And I really kind of held that stance for many years. But now I also understand kind of culturally that in order to be culturally sensitive, maybe people aren't comfortable with that and they do want to use kind of passed away or passed on, for example, and maybe I should match that. The one place where I will kind of hold strong, and we'll circle back on this when we get to the children lecture, is that children do need the pretty concrete language, because the euphemisms are confusing for them and they can't always understand when somebody says when we lost grandpa. They're like, well, we didn't lose him, he died, and I have certainly found adults too who really needed that kind of concrete language to grasp it. So you can just be thinking here what you prefer. And my classes are usually really kind of divided on this. So in American society, and this obviously is a generalization, a lot of people have much less personal experience with death than in decades past, when death was much more around you all the time. And now just much more kind of vicarious experiences with violent and traumatic death via the news, disasters, war, homicides, and also fictional deaths in TV and movies. And so violent death is, kind of over portrayed. And, natural deaths aren't portrayed as much. And when they are, it seems kind of more sanitized and really peaceful. It doesn't depict people dying alone or dying agitated or the death rattle or their eyes staying open. And so we just don't have very kind of accurate depictions of death in our media. Okay, so thinking about kind of death in the media, there's something called mean world syndrome, which was developed by Gerbner a couple of decades ago, I believe. If you decide to watch this 5-minute clip, I just have to prepare you that it starts with a lot of violence at the start. And so you might, choose to just close your eyes on that. But the idea is that this came out of the idea that, which you've probably heard, that like watching violent media or playing violent video games is going to make you violent. And what the research actually finds is that only happens for a really small subset of the population, where maybe it exacerbates their already kind of hostile or aggressive impulses. But in general, what happens is, in addition to kind of being desensitized to violence and victims, because we see it so much in our movies and TV, it also is mainly making us more scared. It makes us feel like kind of danger could be around any corner, or lurking all outside our homes. So it increases our sense of kind of mistrust. And of course, it's well documented that in the media, we've tended to highlight, whether in news or in fictional media, crimes committed by especially men of color. And so it tends to reinforce kind of negative racial stereotypes as well. Okay, so you can just kind of reflect here. Does watching violent media make you fearful? Are there other people who who seem more fearful? I noticed, for example, that around COVID, that my friends who were getting their information from watching the news rather than reading it in the newspaper were much more kind of panicked, about getting COVID. I also noticed that some people can watch kind of violent things and it doesn't kind of increase their sense of fearfulness, and other people it really does. I, for one, can't watch any type of scary movie because those images end up being totally burned in my brain. All right, we're done. Good job making it to the end, and we're just closing out with this awesome, beautiful picture from my parents' backyard that my dad took. So take some deep breaths, enjoy the green, shake off the dust, move on with your day.